All right, hello, good evening, everybody. Would like to start by welcoming you all and thanking you for joining us tonight for our Streamside Restoration webinar. Really happy to have you here. My name is Zoe Nelson and I'm the Education Program Manager at King Conservation District. So I just wanted to briefly introduce King Conservation District. This presentation tonight is being hosted by King Conservation District. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, we are a unique type of government agency. So we are a special purpose district, and this is similar to like a water or a school district, but our focus is on soil and water conservation. So King Conservation District, or KCD, as you'll probably hear us referring to it, is a non-regulatory and non-enforcement agency, and we help community members of King County manage natural resources. And the way we do that is through providing technical assistance to private residents in forest management, farm conservation planning, wildfire preparedness, as well as streamside and shoreline enhancement. So if someone out there in King County has a farm, a stream, a creek, or a small lot forest, we have experts that can actually help provide recommendations on how to best sustainably manage land. So we have many different environmental programs. One focus at KCD is education and outreach, and we are who is bringing you this presentation tonight. We also have several other programs that may be relevant to you, and we'll be sure to share them out at some point this evening. And you can always check our website as well for upcoming events. So once again, thank you so much for joining us for this Streamside Restoration webinar. As I mentioned, tonight we do have a number of KCD staff on the call, so I just wanted to give them a chance to briefly introduce themselves. Emma, if you wouldn't mind just introducing yourself quickly.
Hi, I'm Emma Atkinson. I'm an AmeriCorps intern with KCD, focusing on education.
Thanks, Emma. And Emma will also be our Zoom tech support. So Emma, if you wouldn't mind dropping your email in the chat. And then we also have on the call tonight, Ashley Allen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Ashley Allen. I'm KCD's Urban Riparian Habitat Stewardship Program Coordinator. Really long title, but I do something that's a little bit simpler. I just work one-on-one with folks who have aquatic areas on their properties, specifically, coordinating the urban program, folks who are living within KCD's member jurisdiction cities. And I help to make recommendations about how they can control noxious weeds and just make a healthier buffer, streamside or aquatic area buffer, by planting native plants.
Awesome, thanks, Ashley. And that is a lot of what we're going to be talking about tonight. So super excited to introduce Madeline Cooper, who will be leading our talk this evening. Take it away, Madeline.
Yeah, thank you, Zoe. All right, so I'm Madeline. I'm the education coordinator at KCD. So I help educate people on all the natural resource work that KCD does. And prior to this job, I was doing restoration on the ground every day, both in riparian and upland areas, mostly in South King County. So this is a topic that I'm really excited to talk about today. And like I said, yeah, we're here to talk about stream and lakeside properties, but this information is definitely relevant for the restoration of upland or urban areas. And if everyone could just share in the chat, if you live on or near a specific lake, river, creek, or wetland, that'll just give us an idea kind of where people are coming from and what types of water bodies we have represented today in our webinar. All right, so streamside restoration. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of lakes, streams, and rivers, how urban and suburban areas can impact those waterways, and how riparian restoration can help improve the health of all of our Pacific Northwest waterways. Cool. So let's talk a little bit more about some of our water features. Streams and rivers are a really important part of our landscape in the Pacific Northwest, and they have three primary functions. They move water, they transport sediment, and they provide habitat both to animals and plants living in the water and around the water. Wetlands are a really special and unique part of our landscape, and in the Pacific Northwest, they're fairly common. So wetlands act as a sponge and they absorb heavy rainfall, and then they also filter that water before it enters the rest of the water system. So they do a great job of filtering out toxins and pollutants, and they're also home to a lot of specialized plant and animal species that don't really live anywhere else. Lakes also play a really important role in our water system because they ease the impacts of flooding and drought by storing large amounts of water. They also help infiltrate groundwater and provide habitat in and around the water for many species. So no matter what type of water body you're living on, they're definitely providing an important function in our watersheds. And so that's why we really want to protect them. So let's think a little bit about how our area has changed over time and what that means for our waterways. So this is an aerial photo of Renton from 1936. You can see the location of KCD's office right where the star is. We can see the Duwamish Green River right over here on the corner. But what we can really see is that there's a ton of forested and farmland area in this aerial photo. We can contrast that with the same area of Renton in 2017. So there's the Green Duwamish River, there's KCD's office, but what we see here is a lot more development and a lot more impermeable surfaces. So impermeable surfaces are things like buildings and roadways that water is going to just fall right off of instead of absorbing into. And so when we go from this forested natural area to the more urban or suburban development, we impact the amount of water that's infiltrating into the soil. So when we talk about water infiltrating, we mean that it's absorbing down in, it's filtering through, it's not running straight off into our surface water system. So in a natural setting, we see about 10% of that water running off into our surface water system. While in these more developed areas that have all of those impermeable surfaces, we see a lot closer to 55% of water running off into the surface water. And that means that it's picking up toxins and pollutants and sediment and carrying all of that into our waterways. And when we're talking about runoff, I think it's really important to note that water falling on lawns typically is just moving within the top 4 to 8 inches of soil. And while it's there, it's picking up a lot of phosphorus. So that phosphorus, it's not just in fertilizer. So whether or not you're fertilizing your lawns, it's present because it's in organic matter like leaves, grass clippings, pet waste, and dishwashing soap. So whether or not your lawn is fertilized, it's generating more phosphorus per year than a forested or landscaped areas. And while the grass can filter metals and oils, it's a really poor filter for phosphorus and other nutrients. And like I said, is actually producing phosphorus. So it's just a little bit of nuance when we're thinking about the surfaces that are covering our watersheds. So we kind of want to start by thinking about what are the features and functions of these natural water systems. So natural water systems have clean, clear, and cool water so that it's low temperatures, high dissolved oxygen, and less pollution. They're home to many diverse aquatic organisms at all parts of the food web. They have large woody debris in them that creates complex habitat. So you can see there's some downed wood and trees in this photo of a river. And they have complexity in their stream channel. So they're not channelized to be super straight, and they haven't been cleared out of big boulders and woody debris. The last important feature we want to think about for these natural systems is a large buffer of riparian vegetation. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about those buffers today. So we call the land directly adjacent to the water a riparian zone. And in a natural system, riparian zones are made up of plants that are diverse and local. They're distinct from upland plants because they're really adapted to living near the creek or the water body, and they have a higher moisture content in the soil. And they're really important because these are the plants that shade and cool the water. They provide habitat and food for animals, and they create leaf litter, which is the base of the food chain for our aquatic organisms. So a really key part of our waterways. Riparian buffers also help filter pollutants and runoff. So surface water is slowed down and filtered before it enters that waterway. This is a picture of Longfellow Creek in West Seattle. So this is a great example of a place where a forested area is helping to buffer some of the land use impacts from the water system. Longfellow Creek is highly urbanized, so you don't see buffers like these everywhere. And it's actually a really important habitat for coho salmon. But one of the effects we see in places with few buffers or not enough buffers is because of all those pollutants and warm water temperatures, we're seeing salmon die before they're able to spawn when they return to the freshwater creek in the fall. So we'd love to see like more areas like this buffered with that native vegetation. So another feature of these natural systems that we're talking about is that the shorelines are stabilized by roots. And this is really going to control erosion. Roots are even better than engineered structures because trees get stronger over time and they can adapt to changing conditions. And that root depth and complexity is one of the advantages of using native plants in your yard. So we can see here in this diagram with native plants on the right that most of our native plants have deeper and more complex root systems than similar invasive species. And that's what's really going to hold on to soil, keep it in place, more so than when we have invasive species taking over our landscapes. And you can see this taproot, or in the case of ivy, like a single very small root as compared to these large and complex root systems that we see in our native plants. So in vegetated water bodies, we see many of the same features and functions as in natural water bodies. So that includes fewer toxins and pollutants in the water, less erosion and clear water, and cooler water temperatures, which are really key for the health of our salmon populations. So our goal with riparian restoration is really to bring the important functions and features of natural waterways to these vegetated lakeshores and streams in urban and suburban areas. And vegetated waterways offer improved wildlife habitat for birds, amphibians, mammals, and insects. And because of the interconnected nature of our watersheds, we often see improvements to one part of the ecosystem ripple out and have continued positive effects for many other plants and animals. We also see a lot of benefits specifically for salmon, and salmon are really ecologically and culturally important here in the Pacific Northwest. Clean, clear, and cold creek water are all really important for salmon who are rearing in creeks. And some juvenile salmon rear in lakes for several months before migrating out to the sea. And those juvenile fish typically follow the shoreline, so they need shallow, complex habitat for refuge. And aquatic vegetation is really providing that safe and cool, healthy habitat for them to grow in. And it's interesting to note that salmon actually avoid swimming under docks when they're migrating out to the ocean. So they usually go around the docks into open, dark water, and that's the perfect habitat for predatory fish that eat these juvenile salmon. Another benefit of vegetated lakeshores is less goose poop. So if you live on a lake and are tired of stepping in the goose poop, this might be a great reason to plant some native vegetation. And that's because geese prefer those wide open areas where they can really see predators coming. They don't really like to hang out in that tall vegetation because they can't see what's going on around them. Another big source of bacterial contamination in our watersheds is dog poop. And dog waste also carries fecal coliform bacteria, roundworms, and giardia, and those can all sicken people if consumed. The people most likely to get sick are children who are playing outside, people who are gardening, and people who are swimming and recreating in our natural water bodies. And the thing about dog poop is if it's not cleaned up, it can last for 4 years in your yard. So it's really important to pick it up right away, So the bacteria and parasites that I talked about don't end up in our waterways getting people sick. So our streams, lakes, and wetlands are just a really beautiful and unique part of our Pacific Northwest ecosystem. And if you live along one of these waterways, you have a unique opportunity to protect these special places and really be that last line of defense against some of the pressures that we talked about today. And you can do that by planting plants that provide habitat, shade, and water filtration. So our goal with all of this is really to get to a place where we can keep the functions of our natural system within our urban landscape and balance having those functions in addition to the other uses we have on our land. And we do this through a process called riparian restoration. So our goal is to go from this here, which I think if you're from the Pacific Northwest, you might recognize that as a big patch of Himalayan blackberry, a super annoying weedy species. And we really want to end up with something more like this, which is a really diverse, beautiful riparian buffer. So let's talk a little bit about the steps of restoration. First, we need to remove and control invasive plant species. That's going to create some bare soil, so we're going to need to do some erosion control. We can plant native plants that are eventually going to do that erosion control themselves. To get those plants started nice and healthy, we're going to want to mulch. And then over time, there is some maintenance needs. And you'll hear people talk about native plants being very low maintenance, but I just want to remind everyone that low maintenance is not the same as no maintenance. And that is a really important step that often gets overlooked. So this might be a common scene for those of you who live near these water bodies in our urban areas. We often see multiple invasive species. This is a photo from Thornton Creek in Seattle. And if you recognize any of these invasive species or know that you have any other invasive species in your yard, go ahead and share them in the chat just so we can get an idea of what everyone is dealing with. We're only going to talk about a few common species today, so you can ask specific questions in the chat, or you can look into some of these resources that I'm going to share later. So step one, invasive plant removal and control. We want to determine which invasive species that we're dealing with, and that's going to help inform the removal technique. We also want to think about the site and location that we're in, because that'll have some impacts on it as well. And with invasive species control, there are a lot of different options. And often it's best to use a little bit of everything. There is not one right way to do this, and you often are going to have to try multiple methods and take some time and be patient to really get this to work. But we're going to talk about some of these methods more specifically. So a big one, and I think one that most people probably start with right away, is that manual removal, which is exactly what it sounds like. You're going to use hand tools and muscle to remove plants. In most cases, you need to get those roots out as well, since that's really how the plant is storing energy and continuing to grow. So you can see in this photo here, people are pulling out ivy, but this might mean digging out blackberry roots, peeling morning glory vines away from a tree, or other methods like that. Mechanical removal, that usually refers to cutting, mowing, brush cutting, or crushing up invasive species. And this is all about starving the roots and can be really effective. So the goal is to remove the leaves of the plants that are making sugar for storage and eventually starve the roots. This doesn't work with every plant. So blackberries are a really good example of one that you can cut and cut and cut year after year, and that is still going to be alive and growing every year. But for some plants, for some invasive grasses, this can be really effective. And if you live on a steep slope and you don't want to disturb the soil, this is a good option that's a little less invasive. It is important to note that some cities have rules against using power tools in these critical riparian areas. So you'll definitely want to look into your local rules and regulations to figure out if that's allowed. Sheet mulching is a great option to suppress weeds, and it's often used with invasive grasses, and it's often used in combination with planting into an area. So you can see in these photos, these projects are trying to suppress the grass around where they've installed some new native plants, and then eventually over time, those plants are going to grow large enough where they can do a lot of the work for you. Chemical control is often a last resort, but it can be a really valuable tool, especially when you're battling some really aggressive invasive weeds like Japanese knotweed. And if there's a risk of those chemicals drifting into a water body, you do have to hire a professional with an approved aquatic applicator's license. So that's an important consideration if you are living on one of these waterways. And it's really best to use this as a last resort and in the smallest quantity needed to get the job done. And that's another reason to work with a professional, because they're going to know kind of the best way to go about using these chemical control methods. So shade. Many of our weeds can be controlled in this manner, and this is going to be one of your main long-term defenses against weeds coming back. So if we remove a bunch of blackberry and then are able to plant a bunch of trees and shade the area, that blackberry is far less likely to come back because a functioning ecosystem is just a lot better at keeping weeds out. All right, so now we're going to talk about some of the common invasive weeds in our area. English ivy is definitely one that you may have seen around the Pacific Northwest. It's a very invasive vine, and it can grow along the ground or up trees. And when it's growing vertically, that's when it's producing berries. So it can reproduce. So we definitely want to control it if we start to see it growing vertically, so it's not producing more ivy. And one big problem with ivy, in addition to kind of covering the ground and making it difficult for other plants to grow, is that it adds so much weight to trees that it can actually pull them down. So to remove ivy, like I said, we first want to start with where it's growing vertically and remove those roots from the tree about 5 feet up the trunk, and then remove it from the ground about 10 feet all the way around the tree. And so you can remove the roots that you cut low on the trunk, but you don't actually need to pull them off the higher part of the trunk because they will die on their own, and it can be dangerous to pull them off yourself. For ivy that's growing on the ground, luckily it has a very shallow root system, and you really can remove it very well by hand. If you have a big patch of ground ivy, you can hopefully get some friends or neighbors together and kind of pull the roots out and roll it up like an ivy burrito. If you have less ivy, it might just be easier to kind of pull it out bit by bit with your hands. Disposal of that ivy can be a little bit tricky. You don't want to leave it on the ground because it can resprout. So you're going to want to elevate it off the ground in some way. A really common technique is using dead wood or logs to kind of create some airspace between the ivy and the ground, make a little raft for those piles of removed ivy to sit on. All right, Himalayan blackberry. And I think it's important to remember that we do have a native blackberry in the Pacific Northwest. Our trailing blackberry is a great local species, but it grows really differently. It's going to grow as a low kind of creeping ground cover, whereas Himalayan blackberry is going to really form these thickets and reach up towards the sun. Oh, I'm sorry. A really good method for removing blackberry, because it does form these thorny thickets. It can be hard to get in there. So you can often cut or mow and leave about a foot of stem. And then you can either go back through and apply herbicide to the regrowth, or you can just dig out those roots once it's been cut away and you can kind of get in there. Japanese knotweed. We have a couple varieties of knotweed here, and they're all incredibly aggressive. They kind of have a bamboo-like appearance, and they spread by these underground rhizomes that can't really be dug out and shouldn't be disturbed. So the main important thing to know about this plant is you really don't want to try to dig it out. You don't want to try to mow it, because any disruption can spur more growth and make things more difficult later on. And if you do start cutting it, a new knotweed plant can grow from just a 3-inch piece of stem. So this is really a time when you're probably going to need to hire a professional who can do that chemical removal. And because this is such a problematic weed, there are programs out there that can help and provide resources on removing this weed. And I'll share more information about that in the resources at the end of the presentation. So we have a couple of woody invasive trees in this area, English laurel and English holly. And this is another case where it might look like a tree. It might look like you can just cut it down and be done with it. But these plants will also kind of be spurred to grow more when you cut them like that. So this is another instance to use herbicide. And you can see how glossy and waxy these leaves are. Those glossy, waxy leaves are really an indication that just spraying herbicide on these leaves is not going to do much to affect that plant at all. So either they can be cut and herbicide applied to the cut stump, or the herbicide can be injected directly into the trunk, and it'll go down into those roots, and eventually the tree will die. In both cases, you can actually just leave that tree there as it dies, and it's going to provide really great wildlife habitat. So those were just a few of our weedy invasive plants. But if you have other plants that you're not sure about or just want to learn more, King County Noxious Weeds is a great resource, and I will send out information about that. So once we've removed a bunch of plants, we have all this bare soil, and we talked about some of the problems associated with extra sediment ending up in our waterways. So we do want to do some erosion control to prevent that from happening. And temporary erosion control is really going to do that job while new plants get their roots established, and then they can do that job themselves. So you have a couple different options. Erosion fabric, like you see on the left, is made out of coir or jute. And then on the right, you see these straw wattles that are holding that slope in place. And in both cases, these will break down over time. So it's just a really nice option while your plants get established. So now we're on to planting, which I think is probably the most fun part of this restoration process. But you can't just throw a bunch of plants in the ground and say, great, I did it. We really want you to be a detective and learn as much about your restoration site as you can before you choose those plants. So really looking at the soil, water, and light conditions is going to help you determine what plants are going to grow best at your site. So noticing things like, does your soil feel rocky and does it dry out quickly? Do you notice water pool and not really move? Those are good indications what's going on with your soil and water conditions. And if you ever have noticed anything about the soil at the site where you live or work, go ahead and share it in the chat. So when we talk about light requirements for different plants, every plant has their own preferences. If they like full sun, that's going to be a minimum of 6 hours of direct sunlight a day. Partial sun means 3 to 6 hours of direct sunlight. Partial shade is a similar amount of sunlight, but those plants might be sensitive to that strong afternoon sun and might want some shade at that time. And plants that do well in the full shade need less than 3 hours of direct sunlight a day. So in choosing the right plants for your site, it can be really helpful to make a map. And it can be a map like this that you get, an aerial photo of. It can also just be a drawing on a piece of paper. But what is really helpful to outline is those moisture and light conditions. So you can see on this map, we have a wet, sunny zone around the lake. And then a little bit upland from the lake, we have a dry soil sunny area and a dry soil with mixed sun and shade. And so you might pick different types of plants for each of these 3 zones. The tool that we use to get that aerial photo is King County IMAP. So if you do want to make a map like that, you can look for King County IMAP. You can put in your address and find your property. And then you can also use the tools on there to create those zones. You can measure square footage. There's a lot that you can do if you want to explore that tool. So there are some more considerations before planting. You still can't just go for it. You want to make sure there's no underground utilities where you're planning on digging. So definitely call 811 or go to call811.com to find out if there's anything underground that you need to be aware of. For planting trees and shrubs, we want to think about their future growth. So that might mean not planting tall trees or vines near power lines. If you have vaults and meters, you want to keep them physically and visually accessible. And then if you're planting thicket forming and fast spreading species like salmonberry or rose, you might not want to do that directly next to paths or project edges where they might kind of start encroaching on that space. One reason you don't want to plant trees near power lines is because you really want to avoid topping trees. It's not good for the health of the tree. And then you also end up with these like very goofy looking trees that just aren't as visually appealing. And then, like I said, avoiding planting those thicket forming plants right near a path where that might mean you have to go in and prune them more regularly. And once again, I just want to remind everybody that you are going to expect to do some maintenance, but by taking these things into consideration, you really are reducing the amount of future maintenance you're going to need to do. So now you want to consider your plant placement. And one nice option is to create this kind of layered transition between a lawn and the buffer area. So in this photo, we have this very low ground cover layer of kinnikinnick, a kind of medium layer of sword fern, and then we get into these taller trees and shrubs. And so this creates this very visually appealing landscape. It draws the eye upward. It feels very, very just nice and open, but we're using entirely native plants here. You might want to consider placing your plants to maintain view corridors, paths, access to the water, if that's something you're interested in. So you can use your map even to draw out where you're going to put plants and think about when they do grow and get larger, what type of space are they going to be taking up? Great. So now you've made all your decisions about what type of plants you're going to install, and it's time to consider what type of plant stock you're going to buy. So we have potted plants, bare roots, plugs, and live stakes, and we're going to talk about some pros and cons for all of these. So potted plants are great. They have a high survival rate. They're very available at nurseries. They're really easy to plant, and if you can't plant them right away, they really will be fine staying in those pots for a little while. Some cons are that this is the most expensive type of plant material you can buy. They can be difficult to transport. So if you need a large number of plants and you don't have a nice flatbed truck, you're only going to be able to fit so many of these in your car. And then because they do come in these pots of soil, they might have weeds from the nursery. So that's just something to be aware of, and maybe pull those weeds out before they become a problem. Bare roots and plugs are another good option. These ones are really cheap. They can be less than $1 each. They adapt really well to our native soils, and they're easy to transport. So a bag of 50 bare root trees, you could throw it on the front seat of your car, no problem. It's not going to make a mess. It's going to be very easy. Some of the cons of bare roots, they have a much narrower planting window because they're often not available till late in the winter. So you might only be able to plant them from January till March. They're sold in large bundles. So usually you have to buy 25 to 50 plants per species. So if you're doing a small restoration project, this might not be the best option for you. there's fewer suppliers, and just because those roots are exposed and they're delicate, you want to handle them gently and really take your time planting them. And because of that delicateness, they might have higher mortality rates. So you might just have to plant a few more than you want to survive, or plan on replanting if you do see any die. Live stakes are a great option, especially if you have any of the live stake species already on your property. So a live stake is really just a stick, and we're going to bury it about 2/3 of the way up in some very moist soil, and it's going to turn into a tree. And these are great for wet sites because they do need to be installed in very wet soil. They're really cheap if you buy them, and if you have willows, red osier, dogwood, or cottonwood on your property or a friend's property, you can cut your own live stakes, and they're free because they are just sticks. They're really easy to transport and to plant. Some downsides are that you really can only use a few different species. So like I said, willow, red osier, dogwood, and cottonwood. They have a higher mortality rate. So this is one where you're definitely going to want to install more live stakes than you plan on having kind of at the end of your project. And if you have beavers on your property, these are just a great beaver snack, and they might not survive at all. So in the Pacific Northwest, it's really important to install our plants during our rainy season, which is usually October through March or April, but definitely as we see our rain patterns shifting, you'll want to keep an eye on that. And if it's early in that season and it's not raining yet, you might need to hold off and wait for a little bit. Container plants are great because they can be planted in that entire window. Stakes you want to plant earlier in that window so they have more time to stay wet and grow those roots before things start to dry out. And then because bare root plants aren't usually available until at least January, they have to be planted quicker at the end of that window. If you are planting in a wetland, that's a little bit of a special case because you want to plant at the end of the dry season, right before the rain starts again. And that's when it's easiest to plant. And then hopefully soon those plants will get the rain that they need to start growing well. All right, so we're just going to talk about a few highlighted native species. This is not all your options, but this is definitely a good place to start. And then we will share more resources where you can find information about other native plants. So first we want to kind of think about plants that love moisture. So these might be the plants that go closest to your water body. Western red cedar, if you have room for a big tree, this is an awesome one to plant. It's really going to provide that shade that we were talking about that does a lot of that work of keeping weeds out for you. It really needs that wet, moist conditions with a little bit of shade. So this is one that's not very tolerant to drought. So if you do have drier conditions at your site, it's probably not going to be a great option. But if you are able to put one in, it's a really great tree. It has a lot of cultural significance in the Pacific Northwest. The wood is rot resistant, so it's been used to make dugout canoes, totem poles, baskets, clothing, hats, and lots of different tools. So this is just a really special Pacific Northwest tree. Pacific ninebark is a great shrub option for those wet or moist areas. And even if you see some ponding or pooling, the Pacific ninebark can handle that. They have beautiful white and pink blooms that become pink seed pods. So not only are they adding beauty for your garden, but they're a really valuable resource for wildlife for an extended period of time. And they do have this really unique bark that people thought grew in 9 layers. That's not the case, but it's how it got its name. And I do want to point out that you'll see the Latin or scientific name at the top of all of these slides. It can be really helpful if you're going to a nursery to have that Latin name written down, just so you can verify. If you tell the nursery you want a cedar, that will help you determine that you're getting the kind of cedar that you want. Red osier dogwood. This is one of my favorite native shrubs. It likes that moist soil, but it can do okay in some drier spots as well. It has these really open clusters of flowers, more open than a typical dogwood flower. And this is a great one for adding some winter color to your yard, because those bright red stems, it's going to lose all its leaves and it's going to look very dramatic in the winter. This is also a great one for providing winter food for deer and elk. All right. Once you start moving away from your water body a little bit, your soil is probably going to get a little more dry, and these are some options. Nootka rose. This is a great one for forming natural hedgerows or fences to kind of form a barrier. This is definitely one of those thicket forming, tall spreading plants. So it can really do a lot of work of filling in that area where you may have created some bare soil. It has really beautiful pink flowers, so it's great for pollinators. And then once again, in the winter, you're going to get kind of a fun, these little rose hips that are a really high source of vitamin C. Right, mock orange. This is another one with some great flowers. This does really well in dry, rocky soils. It gets covered in these white flowers, but I think the really special thing about this plant is these flowers are super fragrant. So if you are a person who is excited about attracting pollinators to your yard, this is a great option. Or if you're a person who just likes to smell a nice flower. Another good pollinator option is the red flowering currant. And hummingbirds in particular love this plant. And this one also does well in those drier areas with medium sun. And it really does get covered in these pink flowers. And then it's gonna make some sour little dark blueberries. We can totally eat them, but they don't taste very good to us. So they're great to leave for wildlife. I have heard of people making jam out of them because they're adding, if you add a lot of sugar, they will taste better, but a great wildlife food source. Oregon grape is another good one if you want to create some kind of interest in the winter, because it is a broadleaf evergreen, so it keeps its nice green leaves year round. In the spring, it gets these beautiful yellow flowers and then is going to produce dark berries. Once again, not that tasty for us, but great for birds and wildlife. This is really easy to mistake with that English holly invasive species that I talked about. But the way that you're going to tell it apart is that it has these little leaflets that are paired on the branch. They kind of have a buddy on the branch, whereas holly has leaves that alternate and sit alone on the branch. Kinnikinnick is that low growing ground cover that you saw a few slides back, kind of creating that transition. This is another broadleaf evergreen, and this is a good one to plant once your restoration site has established itself a little bit, and it will really fill in those gaps. All right, so we also have some generalist plant species that are going to do well everywhere. So these are the plants that are more like raccoon that can live anywhere it wants, as opposed to the koala that can only live in the eucalyptus trees. Shore pine is a great option for a smaller conifer that don't get as tall as our western red cedars, as our Doug firs. And they're also really flexible in their growing conditions. You can put them in a lot of different soil and light conditions. There's a picture of the whole tree. Vine maples are a great small tree option. They only get 12 to 20 feet tall, so it's great if you have a small space. They have these really cute little flowers that a lot of our native bees really like. And while they prefer some moist soil, they can do a mixture of sun and shade. And we're gonna get some beautiful fall color from these little trees. Osoberry is a great option if you like a sign that spring is coming. It leaves out and blooms super early. So it's also a really important wildlife plant, because animals that have not been eating a lot throughout the winter are very excited to see these little berries form early. Once again, this is a plant that you can eat it if you want, but it's not going to taste very good, and probably the birds and little mammals are going to get to it long before you do. Snowberry is a nice low growing, thicket forming plant that can also kind of fill in those spaces, and they have these unique white berries that last through the winter. Salal, another kind of low growing plant. This is a really common understory species in Western Washington, and it's another evergreen plant, so it's going to stay green year round. It's got these cute little flowers and some nice berries for wildlife. If you want to learn about more native plants that are options for your restoration site, you can go check out King County Go Native to learn a lot more. All right, so where to buy this plant stock? I'm going to share in the resource guide some locations where you can buy plants, but it is good to know that conservation districts in our area usually hold bare root sales, and many nurseries have potted native plants. All right, mulching, our step to kind of keep everything alive. We want a 4 to 6 inch layer of mulch over that bare soil, and that's going to add nutrients to the soil and help retain moisture. You can either sheet mulch in your whole area like you see in this picture, or if you don't have as much mulch, you can add a little ring of mulch around each plant that you plant. And not only is this going to help your plant stay healthy, but it's also going to suppress some weeds that might be trying to come back at this stage. Leaf litter is a great option if you're not able to buy wood chip mulch. This is, if you have a big tree, this is free mulch. It does all the same things that our wood chip mulch does: erosion control, adds nutrients, keeps soil moisture there, and it's great amphibian and insect habitat. All right, so maintenance, we call this step 5 through 105, and this is the most important step that you will do. So in those first 5 years, that's the most important, and you're going to want to monitor and control invasive species that are regrowing or new weeds. If your plant survivorship falls below 80%, you might want to replant some of those plants. You might need to replace some mulch to keep the soil covered. And although our native plants are adapted to our dry summers here, it could be helpful to do some irrigation in the first 1 or 2 summers during those really, really hot periods. But it's important that you don't water too much and get them reliant on being watered in the summer. And you do want to water deeply to encourage their roots to grow deep down into the soil and not just stay at the surface. So KCD is here to help with these projects. We have technical assistance from people like Ashley. If you live along a stream, river, or wetland in King County, everyone in KCD's service area can get 5 free soil tests. And as I mentioned, we do that bare root native plant sale, and you'll see that come out next November. So we do offer aquatic area enhancement services to help urban land managers protect and improve the health of creeks, streams, rivers, and wetlands. And if you have a property within the KCD member jurisdiction city limits and a minimum plantable buffer of 15 to 35 feet, depending on your stream width, and you make a 15-year project agreement with KCD, you might be eligible for some of those services. Like I've said a couple times, I will be sending out a whole bunch of additional resources for you, and you're also free to follow up with us with any questions that don't get answered in our Q&A today. I did just want to let people know about some upcoming events, and because we are getting a little short on time, I'll make sure to include a copy of these events in that follow-up email. But if you're interested in learning more or just continuing to be involved, these are all great options. I will also make sure to include myself and Ashley's contact information. If you have general questions, you can contact me. If you're a riparian landowner, definitely reach out to Ashley. And now I think it's time for questions. So I think Zoe and Emma, if you're able to share out those questions, we can start asking them. So if you have not yet put your question into the chat box, now is the time.
Great. Thanks so much, Madeline. All right, so we have a couple questions here. I want to start with one from Harmony that asks, I'm interested in tips on getting kinnikinick to establish without getting weeds growing up between the branches. Ashley, what do you say?
Great question, Harmony. And so I'm going to talk about kinnikinick, but not just kinnikinick, also other ground cover species. Working in restoration with folks, if you recall that slide Madeline showed with all the giant knotweed and then ivy and blackberry, a lot of times that's what we're tackling, and we're trying to replace it with natives. And folks get really excited about species, ground cover species, particularly like kinnikinick, really small stuff. But I always encourage folks, those are great and they should be established in time. But if you're battling really big, mean, nasty weeds, first you have to get control of those weeds and plant some native trees and shrubs that are really going to compete with those. Instead of kind of these smaller ground cover species that can easily be overwhelmed by weeds. Now, that's not to say that they don't have a place. So once you do have really good weed control at your site, that's when you can start putting in species like kinnikinick and other smaller ground cover species. But they still will, have some competitions from some other perennial weeds and other smaller weeds. So it's really about just staying on top of it, especially for the first 2 to 3 growing seasons. Constantly monitoring that site, being on the lookout for those weeds and controlling them quickly and early as they come up. And so kinnikinick, it can be a slower species to establish. So you really do want to make sure that for those first 2 growing seasons, I would say even the first 3, really watching for those weeds and getting them quickly. And then hopefully if you have the right conditions for kinnikinick, the right soil conditions and light conditions, because it does have preferences, then it will start to take off. And once you get kinnikinick really well established, it will become a dense mat and should help, hold its own against some of these weeds that try to compete with it. So on that note, I will say it does tend to prefer more well-drained soils, sandier soils, and typically does well in full sun, but I have seen it also establish in partial shade. And yeah, I would say it's a great plant if you can get it to establish, and best of luck with that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ashley. Someone, Tiana asks, what is a good method to control reed canary grass in and beside waterways?
Yeah, that's, it's tricky. It's really tricky. So we mentioned earlier in this webinar that kind of our last result for some of these weed species is herbicides, but of course, following federal law and Washington state law, we have to make sure that any herbicides being applied near waterways or even with the potential to drain into them accidentally has to be applied by a licensed pesticide applicator licensed through Washington State Department of Agriculture, WSDA, and then they also have to have this additional aquatic endorsement on their license. So if we're looking at small patches of reed canary grass, which we very infrequently are, usually it's huge patches, then chemical control applied by a licensed applicator can be a really effective way. Now, other than that, you can mechanically control it, you can cut it back, but oftentimes what we see is that will actually stimulate more growth. So that's kind of only a short-term temporary solution. Really the long-term solution, the best solution is try to establish dense shade over reed canary grass. reed canary grass is one of those weeds that really needs full sun to flourish. So you really have to try to establish shade, and that takes some time. So you do have to think about trying to install maybe some native species that are faster growing, that will really shoot up over the reed canary grass in a few years. And then long term, looking well into the future, establishing other sources of shade, so conifer trees, but those are much slower growing than some of our deciduous trees. So you have to keep that in mind. That's kind of the long game there. So if you're looking to establish something quick, I would try species like our native willows, Sitka willow, Pacific willow, or red osier dogwood. Those all do great with growing really quickly to start to compete with reed canary grass. And then my final note on that would be that even if you establish some pretty hardy, some pretty good shade over reed canary grass, sometimes you're still going to see these small pockets of it, even in the shade. So I've seen that at a buffer site that we have that's maybe, 15 years or older, and there's still these tiny patches of reed canary grass. So it's trying to control it and know that, eradication is almost impossible. And so just doing our best to do that.
Yeah, man, that's a tricky one. Thanks, Ashley. Another question we have from Muriel, hope I'm saying that right, is I want to transplant stinging nettle for a food source and I have pots to put it in. Do you have any suggestions?
Muriel, I wish I could help you more. I avoid it at all costs. I've been stunned too many times as I've been going through the forest. But I have heard that some people have been able to transplant it by dividing the roots in the fall, late fall, and then wherever they plant it, then they heavily mulch on top of that to really get the organic matter and to encourage fertile soil that stinging nettle prefers. And then of course, I have heard people collecting the seeds and spreading them. If you're trying to establish the seeds indoors first, I think you can try to put them in pots before the last frost of the winter, and then get them established and then later move them outdoors. So that's, haven't done it myself, non-expert in that, but that's just a few recommendations that I've heard that I want to share.
Fantastic, thank you. James asks, is there a best time of year to do streamside restoration on a salmon bearing creek? Yeah. So, I mean, we kind of talked about this a little bit. And for any of the activities that we listed, sometimes there are better times of the year than others. So for weed control, and then also for planting. And then if you have to cross your stream, then that adds a whole nother factor that you have to consider. So I'll try and take those one at a time. So for weed control, I highly recommend researching the weeds that you have, using sources like King County Noxious Weed Control Program, their website and their best management practices for weeds. They have a variety of links on their website. Really look for it's a PDF that says best management practices, because that document is much more detailed than their kind of 1-2 page flyers called their weed alerts. But for some plants that you're hand pulling, creeping buttercup, ivy, it's easier to do that and to get all the roots out of the soil if you're pulling those weeds when the soil is moist. So that's something to consider. If you are, let's say, chemically controlling blackberry, which, again, hopefully by a stream, you're not doing that, then that is most effective typically in the late summer, early fall. So keeping the right weed control timing in mind when you're doing your restoration activities. And then of course, when you're trying to then establish native plants as part of restoration, you really want to do that between October and sometimes early April. I really like to have most of my planting wrapped up by the end of February, especially over these past few years. We've been getting
hotter weather earlier in the year. So if it's a rainy year, maybe you can extend your planting into April and March. And so just keeping that consideration in mind. So try to establish our native plants when they're dormant. That way they'll be well prepared and have their roots growing by the time summer comes, and then they have some stressful situations on their hand. And then finally, yeah, like I mentioned, if you have to cross your stream for restoration and you know there's salmon, try to maybe have a wooden plank or some kind of bridge to get across in the early fall when you know salmon might be migrating back upstream to spawn, because the worst thing that we can do when we're trying to restore salmon habitat is to go and accidentally stomp on salmon redds and salmon eggs as we're trying to restore. So keep that in mind. And then of course, if we're talking about other projects, bigger projects, there's something that's something like installing woody debris, which you probably are not thinking, because that's a much more complicated process with a lot of permits. Then that's when that fish window also comes into consideration, avoiding doing work in the stream when the salmon are returning.
Great. Wow. Thank you, Ashley. A few more questions here coming up. Before I ask the next question, though, I am just going to let y'all know I'm dropping our evaluation form in the chat. So after the Q&A, if you wouldn't mind, please taking a moment to fill this out, so we can only work to improve our presentations in the future. Okay, another question here that we have. Wondering about the process and safety around injecting herbicide into holly that is near other trees. We have one that is right between the roots of a giant pine, and digging it out is nigh impossible.
Yeah, from what I know, it's a pretty targeted application when you're using the injection pellets into holly. So it should from my experience, just target that one plant. But you know, I would go slow with that. Yeah, like I said, it should just affect the holly. In fact, they even say that if you have holly where some of the roots are going down near water, that it's still safe to inject. That's what they say, as long as you're injecting above the water, out of the water. So if we are to believe what the label tells us, then it should just impact the plant that you're injecting.
Great, thank you. Okay, a question here. We have a lot of deer living on our property. Are there any plants you'd recommend that are deer resistant?
Yeah, this is a great question. Deer resistant, because there are plants out there that people swear, yes, they're deer resistant, and then you go and you see a deer munching on them. So I would say, yeah, there's a few ideas. I'm not going to say 100% deer will never eat it, but let's think about, you know, what would they not find yummy or pleasant to eat. So typically that's things with thorns or spiky leaves. So tall Oregon grape is one, low Oregon grape is another. If you have a shadier site, really any of our native roses with thorns, Nootka rose, swamp rose, woodland rose. Let's see, what else have we got? I've heard some people say mock orange is more deer resistant. When we're thinking about conifers, definitely not western red cedar. I have had some success with grand fir, but that's not to say that they haven't taken a test bite here and there. And Salal's another one, evergreen ground cover, great species. And this is another one where usually it's deer resistant, but I went to Cannon Beach a few falls ago, and there were, in this case, it was elk. There were a bunch of elk just going to town eating that salal. So those are just a few ideas. And And then if you're going to plant where there's deer and you can't build a big fence to protect all your plants, then I would say just overplant. Plant very densely, anticipating that there's going to be some browse and some plant mortality.
Yeah, I feel like deer just get desperate enough at some point they'll eat anything. Okay, here we have a question about mugwort. So I figured out that mugwort is very invasive after planting it in my garden. I have since been relocating it to the riparian area where it can spread out and I can still access it for medicinal use. Is mugwort considered a healthy addition to a wetland, or is it problematic?
I actually I'm not as familiar with mugwort, so that's one that we'll probably have to follow up with you about, unless, you know, Zoe or Emma, you have any any thoughts about that?
Anyone?
So it's not considered, it's not on the invasive species list for Washington State, but it is in New York State. And one of the things they note is that it spreads very easily from small fragments and actually has allelopathic traits, which means that the chemicals that it produces can actually kill the plants around it. So I think we would probably advise against introducing it to a wetland environment.
I think sometimes it's helpful to, like, if you have it growing already, like looking at how it's growing, like, do you notice it really like forming a thick carpet and taking over, or is it just kind of staying in one place? You might learn something that way too. But yeah, that's really good information, Emma. Thank you.
All right, what plants would you recommend planting on a sloped portion of my property?
Yeah. Well, I mean, like we talked about, it really depends on your sun conditions and your soil moisture conditions. But in general, for trying to help stabilize the soil, stabilize the slope, you're looking for first a mix of trees, shrubs, and ground covers. That way you have different depths of root systems, kind of all working together to build this network underground to help stabilize the soil. But when we're thinking about shrubs, you're also going to be trying to get species that are faster growing and are spreaders, so that you start covering area a lot more quickly to cover up any exposed soil and help to stabilize that. So if you have shadier conditions with maybe moister soil, I would say salmonberry is a great one that will help spread out really fast. If you have drier soils, maybe sunnier conditions, Nootka rose is a really good one. In terms of tall shrubs, or I guess small trees, vine maple does an excellent job of helping to stabilize slopes. Grand fir, I'll give another shout out to that tree, has a really deep taproot as well, so that's a good tree selection. And snowberry can be a fast spreader as well, and then sword fern is excellent for erosion control. So if you do have shadier conditions, I highly recommend lots of sword fern.
Great. Another question, I'm curious what you might have to say about this as it relates to kind of plants and restoration, but any advice for removing sediment from a pond, or maybe like trying to suppress that, I suppose, through native plants? Oh,
through native plants?
Well, I mean, I don't know, I'm trying to just relate it back to our topic at hand.
Yeah, that's a great question, because oftentimes, especially when we're thinking about ponds or maybe wetlands is a good example. It's good to have a lot of what we call wetland emergent species, or these plants that can survive seasonal saturation to help filter out the water. But oftentimes, you know, they catch sediments in doing so. And so I just want to make sure I'm understanding the question correctly, I guess.
Yeah, it says my pond has much more sediment than I can remove manually myself.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So a lot of times when people run into that situation, they want to dredge, and that's where, you know, digging out the soil. And historically, folks did that all the time, especially with wetlands. So that is a tricky situation. Oftentimes, it's not one that it's not an activity that is permissible. It's usually against various regulations, especially if a pond is classified as a wetland. So I would highly recommend against doing anything like that. I would maybe look upstream to see what the issues are. And I know this can be a challenge because we all live in a watershed and water crosses property boundaries. So sometimes the cause of sediment buildup where you are could be a result of activities upstream. So perhaps if there's a lot of development upstream, a lot of erosion occurring upstream, some of that sediment is coming downstream, and then that sediment loading is occurring on your property. So if it's within your control, I would say look upstream and see if there's opportunities to help slow erosion upstream. And then just know that dredging is highly, highly discouraged and usually against local code. And sometimes folks can get into a lot of trouble if they try to manually, mechanically remove that sediment themselves.
All right. Thank you, Ashley. Those are actually all the questions that we have. Thank you all for joining us. Thank Madeline for your presentation, Emma for supporting tonight, Ashley for all of your wonderful advice and answers to everyone's questions. And that's all we have for you guys tonight. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good night.